Let's go ahead and start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Almighty God, help us to understand the teachings of your church so that we might better understand ourselves through Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. That prayer works really well for today because we're talking a lot about human persons in Christ. That is one of the real central topics of this document, Galimetspez, okay, for part 2 of Galimetspez. Just a reminder, for next week, we will be going through Sacrosanctum Concilium. By we, I mean all of you and Father Justin. I'm just going to be watching, okay? That's a document on the liturgy. He's very good there, so he'll join us. That will be a lot of fun, I hope, for all of us. So Sacrosanctum Concilium for next week. It's not a short document. It's not nearly as long as Galimetspez or Lumen Gentium, and if you don't get through it all, you don't get through it all. Some of it's going to get a little technical in terms of just liturgical practices. If that's not of interest to you, try to read with closer attention to the theory, the principles. Okay, does that make sense? But if you're interested in practices and disciplines, go ahead and read that too. All right, and write a list of all of your questions and complaints about liturgy. Bring them for Father Justin. All right. Today, Galimetspez. So to recap where we were last week, we talked about how the theological consensus amongst many bishops and theologians at the Second Vatican Council that obtained, and these guys worked together to sort of push back against, overthrow, in a sense, much of the power structures that existed at the opening of the council. So that consensus started to break apart once they had claimed their victory. Okay, and you guys remember that? So they've won now, but having now obtained a victory, the theological consensus starts to fall apart because they don't. These distinct theologians and bishops don't necessarily agree on what they're for as much as they agreed on what they were against. Okay? So being against a common enemy held them together. It obtained a union that started to dissolve. And that disagreement, controversy, contention regarding what to do with the church and what the church is for plays a more immediate role in the drafting of Galimetspez, schema number 13, during these last couple of years of the Second Vatican Council, this document that gets promulgated at the very end of 1965. So this document is also, we talked about how Lumen Gentium is a document on the church that focuses on the interior life of our church. Galimetspez is focused on the outside world, the world beyond the visible boundaries of the church. And so, last week we talked about how this document possesses a dialogical structure, we could say, right? So, there is a conversation taking place in the pages of Galimetspez. The church is one dialogue partner, and the world is the other. And we are having a conversation with the world through this document. And the structure, the nature of that conversation is we talk about the world's problems and where they are, or the experience of human beings outside of the church, and then we present to them the answer to all that troubles them, which is Christ and what the church has to say about Christ, okay? So this document has that basic structure. And if you remember, we talked about how the leading Christocentrism, by way of method, in most of the conciliar documents, is jettisoned in Galimetspez. And I probably was not nearly nuanced enough in my presentation of this last week. Because of the dialogical structure of the document, Galimetspez starts by talking about the world out there, and then gets to Christ. But the document gets to Christ in the most profound and essential of ways, and we concluded last week's class by looking at section 22 of Galimetspez, which Pope St. John Paul II understood as being at the very heart of his papacy, okay? And so that section 22 is very important to understanding our church in the wake of his election in 1978, okay? Because that's at the beating heart of what he accomplished as our Holy Father. But also, you could say that section 22 of Galimetspez is like the lens through which to read the entire Second Vatican Council, okay? We are trying to understand human beings in the light of Christ. And everything that comes along with that theologically, philosophically, anthropologically, sociologically, culturally, politically. All of it, every aspect of the human experience through the light of Christ. So in that sense, it's very Christocentric. Okay, does that make sense? So in terms of method, the Christocentrism might be a bit less apparent, but in terms of contents, it's very much a Christocentric document, okay? So that's a brief recap. Now, what's great is, for the first time, this book that I was hoping would be good for us, The Reception of Vatican II, the essay on Galimetspez is actually really, really good. And I'm going to get it posted so you can read it. It's really, really good. It's accessible. It's more than just a statement of various other documents promulgated by the Vatican since the conclusion of the Second Vatican Council. It's readable, it's accessible, and it's really helpful. And so the essay Gaudium in this collection that's on the syllabus is written by Thomas Joseph White. Okay, he is a Dominican. He is the Dominican of Dominicans in the United States right now, I think many would say. He's currently teaching at the Angelicum in Rome, but he is absolutely one of the foremost Dominican theologians working in the church today in the English-speaking world. Okay, so it's great that he wrote this essay. It's wonderfully accessible, and it, I think, does a masterful job at getting at many of the core principles of Galimetspez. So, I said from the beginning that the goal here is to get you guys to read the documents, and then to the extent that there are secondary sources, I'm just here to highlight what these sources are giving you in case you don't read them. So we're going to go through this document. I'm going to add things, but hopefully by the end of this lecture, if you don't read this when it gets onto the course site and emailed to you, you'll be okay. All right? So that's the plan. So Thomas Joseph White starts by asking, I think, a great question, and maybe some of you had this in mind as you were reading Gaudium So let me quote him here. How truly contemporary is this document today? However, in light of important historical changes that have occurred since its publication. One here can think of the fall of communism, the political triumph of capitalist liberalism, the growth of Christianity in the global south, the wide-scale secularization of Europe and North America, the philosophical influence of postmodernity on ontology and ethics, the sexual revolution, the discovery of the human genome and the bioethical practices it has given rise to, the rise of militant Islam, the widespread crisis in Catholic religious orders, the cultural transformation enacted by modern social media, especially through the use of computer and the internet. So that's a great question. If you were reading Galimetspez, this very deliberate attempt by the church to engage the modern world, you might be thinking to yourself, well, the modern world is in no way what it was in the mid-1960s. So is this document relevant? Is it helpful? In what way does it still contribute to our understanding of the church and her relationship to the modern world? Okay? And so White thinks that the document, Galimetspez, has much to say still about the church's relationship to the modern world. But in order to do that, we need to drill down on the essential principles of the document. The application of the principles in some ways might seem outdated and irrelevant, okay? But the principles stand as essential Catholic teaching, all right? Good there? Okay, so some central thematic principles. Here is where we finished with last week a little bit, okay? By all accounts, the goal of Galimetspez in its final form is to present to a modern audience an authentic Christian vision of the human person, understood in light of the mystery of Christ, with an emphasis on common human experience as it points toward our need and capacity for redemption. So the goal of the document is to present a Christological, anthropological vision, okay? So human persons in Christ and human persons without Christ yet, so that we can identify precisely how Christ can heal us, redeem us, okay? So that's the core aim of the document, says Thomas Joseph White. And the presupposition, he says, is that the human condition cannot be fully explained by natural reason alone, and we must have recourse to the revelation given in Jesus Christ. I had not thought of that when I first read Galimetspez to get ready for last week's class. So White is saying here that, okay, let me repeat the line. The presupposition is that the human condition cannot be fully explained by natural reason alone, and we must have recourse to the revelation given in Jesus Christ. Remember, we were talking about to what extent human reason alone, this was several classes ago, and I think when Father Justin was here, when we were reading Dei Verbum, to what extent can human reason make sense of the world and what we are called to be as human beings? Can human reason pursue good stuff out there in the world without faith? Okay? That's an important question. And the fathers of the Second Vatican Council are giving a very clear answer. In a certain way, in a real way, you're going to need faith. Reason alone can only take you so far. Okay? That's the answer. And this is, I think, really important because we're talking about human persons here. So for me, a guy who likes theology, I find this to be very exciting. We use the word person all of the time, okay? But the word person is charged with variable meanings and definitions and connotations, okay? Historically, the word person, etymologically, the word person comes from the Etruscan word fersu. And a fersu is a mask that a performer would wear when participating in a play, okay? And so the term person, persona in Latin, becomes used to identify various actors, roles, characters, speeches in a dramatic performance, okay? In Greek, the word is translated as prosopon, okay? Prosopon. And this gets important because a bunch of really intelligent holy men and women in the first few centuries of the church are trying to make sense of the Trinity, okay? They're trying to make sense of the Trinity. How many persons are there? We can't even have the conversation now without using the word person, right? But how many dialogue partners are there in Scripture? Does that make sense? Who's talking and when? And so some church fathers like Tertullian at the end of the second, at the beginning of the 3rd century, develop what is called a prosopological exegesis. That is an account of Scripture that analyzes the text of the Bible by going through and trying to identify which character is talking, Father, Son, or Spirit. And by doing that important work, a doctrine of the Trinity emerges, okay, in the first few centuries of the church, but also, importantly, a basic understanding of what it is to be a person. A person. The word person, its meaning derives from early Christians trying to make sense of God as revealed in Scripture. And at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, Christ, in his two natures, is identified as being unified, joined in a divine person. And so what we get from Chalcedon in 451 is an understanding that to be a person is to be in relationship and in a relationship with the divine, okay? The meaning of person is always bound up with relationship and divinity. But then something happens. In the early 6th century, a Roman senator named Boethius starts doing a lot of philosophy. Not so much theology, but a lot of philosophy. And he creates a new definition of person, okay? So a person is now an individual substance of a rational nature. That seems to me less exciting than one who stands in a relationship with God, but nonetheless, okay? A person is now defined as an individual substance of a rational nature. And he does this for all kinds of good reasons. He's trying to build up a philosophical system that helps us make sense of truth and God. But that definition gets captured by the Western tradition and is picked up by the best theologians of the scholastic period, including St. Thomas Aquinas. And some contemporary theologians will say that if you want to have a good nerdy time reading theology, watch how Thomas Aquinas tries to apply that very abstract philosophical definition of personhood to God when he's writing on the Trinity. And it's true. It's just a hard definition to work with when you're getting into God's interior life, okay? So that understanding of personhood, what it is to be a person, is really the guiding conception of personhood for several centuries. And what's fascinating is that here at the Second Vatican Council, we're getting back to claiming that to be a person is to stand in relationship and to stand in relationship with the divine. Okay? So I think this is wonderful. Again, if you're a theological nerd, this is great stuff. Okay? So White continues that, if you look at Galimetspez section 22, there are important theological claims, this is his writing, that are made in this important passage. First, Christ, who is both God and man, reveals the human being's nature to himself in its originally intended integrity, not affected by sin, but whole and entire, subject to God, and at the service of the authentic love of other human beings. So if you want to make sense of what is it to be a human person, you look to Christ. And the Christ to whom we look is a Christ who's free from original sin, the defects of the fall, okay? Does that make sense? Okay? Second, the nature in question, this human nature, does not exist concretely without grace. So this is an extension, in a sense, of the first claim. Human persons require grace to be made whole. And White in the essay is going to talk about how the Second Vatican Council Fathers in this document are going to present a transformative vision of the human person. We get transformed through grace given by Christ, okay? Restored. It's a restorative vision of the human person. We get made whole by grace in Christ. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay? Third, this anthropological truth points us toward the significance of the language of the mystery of man. So the word mystery we use a lot. It has a couple of different meanings. In the documents of the Second Vatican Council, and theologically in general, a mystery is something that is beyond the knowledge of human beings standing on our own, okay? Reason can only take us so far. So a mystery is anything that's divine and beyond our own ability to make sense of, which is to say, God comes down and tells us what we need to know, okay? And the mystery gets revealed, all right? So, the grace of Christ thus reveals something present in a hidden way within the fundamental experience of man, that we were meant to live in a higher friendship of life with God. The destiny, or the teleological end of the human person, is made manifest to us in the incarnation and the paschal mystery, okay? The mystery of who we are as human beings gets clearer when we look to Christ. That which we don't know becomes known, all right? And what we learn about ourselves when we look to Christ is that we are called to live in a relationship with God, all right? Good there? Mm-hmm. Making sense? No objections so far? So, as Galimetspez continues, these core principles are going to get built up and then applied to the rest of the world. So if this is what Christ is doing for the Christian, what does that have to do with those who aren't Christians out there in the world? And if you remember Lumen Gentium, when we were working through sections 14, 15, 16 on salvation outside of the church, everybody remember that? Maybe getting uncomfortable or excited, depending on where you are with these things. Galimetspez picks up the same point and just applies it in a slightly different way, that same theological line of thought. Okay, so the grace of Christ is at work in the world in hidden ways, even outside the visible life of the Catholic Church and the sacraments. So we should note various features of the universal vision of Christological grace promoted in the Council. I want to read just a little bit at length what White says here, because I think it will demonstrate the cohesive Christological vision and ecclesiological vision, understanding of the church, that's present both in Lumen Gentium, 14 through 16, and in Galimetspez, all right, so that we can see the scope and the scale of what the Council Fathers want us to understand about Christ and the church, okay? So here we go. What the Council does with this traditional teaching, the teaching is that Christ dies for everyone, okay? So earlier in the essay, White will talk about an early modern controversy in the church known as Jansenism that arises in France and has a profound impact on theology and the life of the church. Jansenism, as a school of thought, taught that grace is only offered to the elect of God, okay, and not to anyone who's not elect, okay? So it's kind of a Calvinism within Catholicism in a lot of ways. We have two schools of human beings, the elect and the reprobate, all right? And the elect get grace, and the reprobate don't, and that's all bound up in the mystery of God's will. So good luck, okay? Good luck. And the Council of Trent absolutely shuts down any tinge of Calvinist theology within the life of the church. So grace is offered to all human beings, and all human beings in their freedom can reject or refuse grace, okay? So that's the central dynamic. God tries to get involved in any human life, and any human life is able to reject whatever kind of grace is offered to them, okay? Good? So that's the traditional teaching. So what the Council does with this traditional teaching is to interpret it in a social, dynamic, and historical way. The grace of Christ is at work in the whole historical sweep of human life and society, just as our human nature is not meant to exist outside of the sphere of a relationship with God in the order of grace, so concrete history is a place where fallen human nature is perpetually affected in concrete ways by the hidden presence and work of grace. Consequently, the broad anthropological vision that Galimetspez promotes is not purely philosophical, but profoundly theological in kind. Even secular modern human beings are not made only for God, but are moved interiorly by the occasional promptings of grace. This is true for us not only as individuals, but also in our communitarian nature, and so it occurs in and through the fabric of human culture. The hidden work of grace can be promoted in and through the spiritual forces of culture, be they religious, political, or artistic, but it can also be resisted and thwarted by those same forces as well. This is wonderfully insightful and also bold. It's taking the application of Trent's teaching on grace and individual persons and applying it to our communitarian social nature. And so saying, just as God shows up in the life of any individual person and tries to do some work, so also grace is at work at the cultural, historical level. All right? That means that culture can lead some persons to God, but just as any one person can get grace wrong, so too can a culture. All right? Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's fascinating, and it's why culture matters. It's why when we talk about the culture wars, okay, it's important that Christians dig in and try to articulate a vision of culture that is reflective of central foundational truths that might not exist in perfect compatibility with what secularism wants to say. But a broken culture can't lead broken people to God, okay? So culture matters. It's important that we have some of the fights or conversations, discourses that we have, all right? And that is an understanding of grace and culture that you're not going to find articulated in the theology of the church very well before the drafting of this document. Okay? So this is a genuine contribution that is entirely consonant with past theological developments in the history of the church. Good? Mm-hmm. All right? So, remember now, in Lumen Gentium, I think this core teaching is present, okay? That grace is out there in other places and persons trying to do the work of God. And at the very center of grace is Christ, and so the church. And then you can build out in concentric circles to eventually incorporate the whole of the world, looking for lesser degrees or intensities of grace, if that makes sense. Do you remember talking about that in Lumen Gentium? Okay? So perfect grace is Christ, but there are traces, elements of grace, of God's life out there beyond the visible structures of Roman Catholicism. All right? It's out there in other religious traditions. It's out there in cultures that haven't been established or founded on Christ or Christian understandings of reality. Grace is out there in any number of ways, okay? But all of the grace that's beyond the visible structures of the church first comes from Christ and the church, okay? So Christ and the church are the source of whatever grace is out there in the world beyond the structures of the church. And two, that grace is in a real way defective, okay? It's lacking what it ought to be because human persons without Christ are lacking. They're less than what we ought to be, okay? Does that make sense? All right? Yeah. So here is, I think, a really cohesive vision of Christ, personhood, culture, and sanctification presented when Lumen Gentium and Galimetspez are put together for a really beautiful vision. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's great.
So grace has classification then?
Yeah, in a sense. And like it gets really, really, really complicated. And like words are used to identify different kinds of grace.
Yes.
And I don't know. I mean, some people think that's really helpful. Some of the important distinctions are helpful. So someone said sanctifying grace. Like, that's helpful. Like, a grace that changes you forever. Like, I use that a lot. That's good. Like, baptismal grace, that's very helpful. But you can get really particular about talking about different kinds of graces that show up. And that hasn't helped me yet. But maybe one day. And if it does, I'll let you know. All right? It's obviously helped someone at some point because we have it all written down. Okay? St. Thomas writes about this very clearly, I think, at the end of the first part of the Summa. No, at the end of the first part of the second part of the Summa. Okay? So, the questions in like the 110s, I think, are all about nature and grace, and then particular kinds of grace. All right? So you can go read it online for free. So White writes that if we pair the texts of Lumen Gentium and Gaudium together, we see that the vision of the church is at once deeply Christocentric and ecclesiocentric. Okay, so Christ and church go hand in hand. They can't be separated from one another. All right? Two important principles follow from this theological perspective, both of which directly impact the anthropology of Galimetspez. So the first point is apologetic. The Council wishes to underscore that the widespread modern aspiration to some form of universal secular humanism has many positive features, but that no fully authentic humanism can exist other than one that is Christian. Okay? An apologetic argument. Y'all can try, but you need Jesus, okay? And you can try and succeed in some ways, but you need Christ, all right? An apologetic point. The second theological point here follows from the principles of grace and nature mentioned above. And this is a claim about what is the value of natural law, okay? And we're getting down to a good theological conversation about what are we as human persons capable of doing in the wake of the fall, okay? How clearly can we understand stuff out there in the world in the wake of the fall, okay? And this distinction carries through much of Galimetspez. When it comes to the natural law, okay, so the universal natural law, you can look out there at the world and learn some essential truths without having to read the Bible. Natural law, okay? That makes sense? Mm-hmm. So the first precept of the natural law is do good, avoid evil. And St. Thomas will talk about how, even a jackal can figure that out, right? Like, I don't think he talks about jackal, but animals do this, right? Like sentient life does this, okay? Like, I'm not a swimming animal, so I don't go in the ocean, okay? Like evil, right? I stay on land. What can we do with that? And to what extent can we build up a perception and understanding of the good in life just working with natural law? And the danger here, on the one hand, would be to say, well, you can't do anything without faith at all, okay? The other danger would be to say, you can do everything with natural law. My personal sense here is that in our country, in the last 20 or so years, in the midst of the culture wars, we've relied on natural law in ways that the law can't provide. We've made more of natural law reasoning than natural law reasoning is capable of giving us. It's not convicting as a form of apologetics, which is to say we need faith. In all of the controversies over marriage in this country, you saw a lot of people, good theologians, appealing to natural law, saying, can't you just see what is true? And the answer of society was, we don't see what is true. And that's because we have been impacted by sin, and we don't see what is true with perfect clarity any longer. Faith restores vision, okay? And so there is a way in which to very really perceive the good, we need faith, okay? Does that make sense? All right. But you can't just say that there's nothing out there in the world that orients us toward some good things in life either, okay? So we need a mediating position. And in Vatican II, in Gaudium that distinction runs through many of the various sections on human life, okay? Does that we're good there? Okay. So, is there anything else I like here? I do like this. Because this all fits together. So, White starts talking about anthropology a bit more directly, and the Council of Trent again. So we've already noted that the line of interpretation that leads from the condemnations of Jansenism to the espousal of the universality of the doctrine of grace. So we've talked about that already. So those same 17th century debates were echoes of the earlier disputes between Rome and the Reformers. Most notably, the questions arose as to whether the fallen human being was capable of aspiring effectively to any moral good whatsoever, and whether the human being was justified by faith alone, or whether justification also entailed the transformation of the human will by the infused virtues of theological hope and charity. And I think this is neat because what Galimetspez does here and what White identifies here is profound continuity between the Council of Trent and the Second Vatican Council on this essential point. And it's basically a reapplication of what we just talked about with nature and the natural law and the relationship between faith and reason. We can get oriented towards some things in life that are good, but faith and grace are necessary. And so, again, in section 22, this all comes beautifully together when the Council Fathers teach that, you can look it up, only in the light of Christ does the mystery of man become manifest, clear. Okay, we only understand ourselves through Christ. So White writes that you can see this line of theological continuity running through from Trent to Galimetspez, that he says, I'll quote him, "We can make a great deal of sense of the anthropology of Galimetspez here by understanding that the human being is able in part to understand the meaning of life, but remains a question or enigma to himself until he confronts Christ." Okay? There is a part of our lives that is just not known to us or made sense of until we turn toward Christ. Good there? All right? So this is the anthropological, Christological vision of Gaudium and it's the most essential teaching of this document. All right? And as I said last week and at the start of this class, there's no getting away from it now because Pope St. John Paul II made much of this over the course of his pontificate, okay? Much of this. He was also directly involved in the drafting of this document, okay? So, good? All right?
Also with his PhD, he did the same.
Also with his PhD, he did the same. So, with that in mind, White turns to some central ethical topics, and this I did want to talk about. He does a better job than what I was thinking. He's smarter than I am. He goes after 5 core principles in the document. I was going to come in and talk a bit more about applied principles, okay? So I think last week I said, let's talk about war. We're not going to talk about war so much, but we're going to talk about the principles that help us make sense of something like war that are found in Galimetspez, okay? So that's the plan. So 5 central ethical topics. The first White describes, he labels the soteriological universality of Jesus, okay? Y'all got that?
Say that again.
The soteriological universality of Jesus. Soteriology, to remind you all, is the theology of salvation, okay? So the universal salvific whatness of Jesus, okay? And this isn't new, right? This is what we talked about. Lumen Gentium 14 through 16 and Galimetspez. I mean, we just went through it, but what's neat here is White is saying this isn't just a point of anthropological importance, okay? So it's not just a matter of understanding human persons, it's also an ethical principle, okay? So making sense of Jesus and salvation matters for doing right and wrong, okay? And in the document, this becomes very clear, okay? So White talks about how, and this is a question we've probably all asked ourselves, what are we supposed to do with faith in a secular culture, right? And what does the reality of secularism mean for articulating a vision of the good life? And what do we do about the truth, doctrinally articulated by the church, that things like religious freedom and freedom of conscience are to be protected, okay? So what does all of that mean for the Christian when it comes to making decisions about right and wrong, and then telling other people about making decisions about right and wrong? That basic question, I mean, this has probably been on all of your minds at some point. Yeah, mine too. So in the context of modern secularity and a defense of principles like freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, in this context, how is the Christocentrism of Galimetspez meant to function meaningfully? So what is the value of this document in a world that's not sort of hardwired for receiving Christ? Okay? And White says, here we might answer briefly by noting 2 important principles. Okay? First, Catholic Christocentrism cannot be dissolved profitably by modern theologians into a general religious anthropology. Okay, so what does that mean? He says that such theologies might hold that Jesus is only the most intensive realization of the ethical religious life under grace, so that there is merely a difference of degree between his grace and that of all other persons, not a difference of kind. So when people are out there in the world trying to figure out how to live, one thing we can't say is, well, there are lots of different ways of being good, okay? The best is Jesus. That's the most intense kind of goodness, but there are all other ways of doing goodness in life, okay? That is a kind of religious pluralism that I talked about in that lecture on Lumen Gentium, okay, that the church rejects. So all of the different religions out there, in a sense, are going to help you get to Jesus. There's a way in which that's true, okay, because the pursuit of divinity leads to divinity if we take it seriously, okay? But to say that everything out there is a viable option in the way of grace loses sight of Christocentrism, okay? So do you see, and this is an ethical principle, okay? Ethics, how does one live in pursuit of the good in life? Well, the Christian is going to say Christ is going to be very important to that project of living the good life, okay? And, again, that's difficultly articulated in a secular culture that requires particular forms of freedom in order to recognize the dignity of human persons, okay? So we have our work cut out for us, all right? Good there? Second, and this is going to be a reapplication of that talk of natural law, okay? So a second point here is that we can speak of two forms of imbalance that a right interpretation of Galimetspez must avoid in our contemporary world, in the context in which we find ourselves, okay? Here is the first imbalance. If one were to claim that in a post-religious age, the teachings of the natural law are wholly inaccessible to human reason, save from within the domain of faith alone and by virtue of the work of grace, okay? So now we're taking that basic anthropological point about what human beings can or can't do, and we're applying it to the world of ethics, morals. How do we live, okay? So if we say that there's no chance of you living a good life unless you have faith in Christ, we've gone a little too far, okay? We would imbalance our moral, ethical understanding of human potentiality, okay? You can get some things right with reason apart from faith, okay? Good there? All right. But on the other hand, the other form of imbalance, if one were to hold that the natural law can be read off of the climate of contemporary secularism, as if the cultural progress of post-religious society should basically dictate evolving moral norms to the Catholic tradition, which should in turn assimilate them passively. So this is the idea that, well, because the natural law really is out there and people are pursuing virtue in all kinds of interesting ways, the church needs to keep up with culture by identifying new manifestations of truth and goodness and then adjust her moral ethical teachings in order to accommodate that which we see as virtuous out there in the world, okay? We can't do that either, all right? Does that make sense to you guys? Okay? So we have to get right human brokenness, essentially, and its application in a variety of ways. So what does sin do to us in terms of our anthropology, who we are, okay? What does sin do to us in terms of our ethics, our moral lives? So White, I like these labels because they're fun. The first form of imbalance is he labels a kind of pure grace extrinsicism, okay? So the only way of getting life right is if something comes to you from outside, and what comes to you from outside is grace, God's life shared with you, okay? To say that's the only way to be a good person is theologically errant, all right? The second kind of imbalance is a kind of Pelagian Intrinsicism. So this is great. Pelagianism is a heresy that says that we can earn, build salvation for ourselves. We kind of really love that, right? Every one of us loves the idea that we've become the good person that we are. And this is the idea here is that, well, because I have direct access to what's good in life, I can do all of the things that will get me to salvation, okay? And what that leaves out is Christ, basically, right? So it's the idea that like in my interior life is what I need to sufficiently pursue the good. And that's not true. You need something from outside of you, and that's grace, okay? Good? All right, so this is the soteriological universality of Jesus. So if you read this essay, hopefully that'll make a little bit more sense by walking through it together. All right, point number 2, what is a human person? This is, again, like we talked about this in a way, but what Thomas Joseph White wants to do here is take the anthropological vision of Galimetspez, again, and then apply it to the ethical world, okay? And so we're talking about various contexts for understanding the same truth. And I hope that makes sense to you guys, okay? So human persons in light of Christ, but then in what ways do we need to grapple with human persons in light of Christ, all right? Ethically, morally, science in the last, 40, 50 years has taught us a lot more about human persons, okay? We understand who we are in very different ways now. Most specifically, modern Big Bang cosmology, evolutionary theory, genetic discovery, and cognitive neuroscience all heavily condition the fundamental understanding of the human being that is communicated typically within the context of the modern Western university system. So we go out there in the world, we learn all of these scientific truths, and then come back to Christian teaching and are confronted with the ethical question, who are we and what should we do with our lives? Okay? That's the basic tension there. And how do we ethically respond as Christians to the fact that biology, physics, chemistry, neuroscience, everything has taught us more about who we are as human persons? What's a way forward for us to take all of that seriously if it points toward truth and yet get Christianity right, okay? So it's an ethical dilemma, all right, with an anthropological import, because it impacts directly who we are. Here, okay, White, being a Dominican, unsurprisingly appeals to St. Thomas Aquinas and says that here is where the angelic doctor really comes to the rescue. So he writes that Aquinas' followers typically insist upon the distinct methodologies of theology, philosophy, and natural sciences as objectively differentiated but also profoundly interrelated forms of scientific learning. So White is saying that in Galimetspez, there is enough Thomism to help us move forward regarding scientific contributions to our understanding of human persons and theologically and philosophically revealed truths about who we are as human persons. And the Thomistic principle is basically everyone needs to stay in their lane, okay? So science, go out there and do the work of science, and come back to philosophy, which is one or two rungs up the ladder of knowledge, and say, here's what we found. Philosophy, take the work of the natural sciences and do what you can to incorporate that into your understanding of reality and truth, okay? And then bring that several rungs up the ladder to theology, okay, where we have the fullness of revelation in Christ through Scripture. And if everyone recognizes, if everyone, we're personifying disciplines of knowledge, but if everyone stays where they're supposed to stay and contributes to whom they are supposed to contribute, then we are okay, all right? So as long as scientists do science and not philosophy or theology, we're all right. But the problem is that few scientists like to remain scientists and not be philosophers or theologians. And they're so bad at philosophy and theology most of the time. So that's the challenge. And you're probably right. So go pick up your Richard Dawkins book at Barnes & Noble, and here is a scientist doing philosophy and theology. He's strayed from his lane, right? Like, he should just do his research and then send it, to me. And I'll tell him what it means, right? So, yeah. Does that make sense to you guys? All right.
Isn't it a flawed assumption that that's gonna be the solution?
Well, the solution gets given by theology in a sense, because it's the highest of the sciences. Science meaning like knowledge writ large in the human experience. Okay, so like if everyone just makes their contribution, but this is, and we'll talk about the common good in a little bit. But this is a basic truth of political organization in society too. Subsidiarity. If y'all just do what y'all are supposed to do and make your contribution to the whole is okay. All right? But if everybody starts thinking that they're a whole and not the part, then society becomes very chaotic. Does that make sense? All right? So as long as the discipline of science makes its contribution to the whole alongside that of philosophy and theology, we are all right. But if we stray from our disciplines, then we run into problems. And also, it's worth mentioning, plenty of philosophers and theologians also stray outside of the purview of their disciplines. All right? So, it's worth noting. So I mean, I've never done anything like that, but others have. Good. All right? So that's that. Ethical point number 3, the nature of human marriage. You guys see this, 47 through 52, if you read the document? This is a great understanding. It's really the best, I think, put together on the nature of marriage. What happens here is really fascinating. What's our time? Who's got a time check for me?
9:30.
Oh, good. We're good. We're right on time. I tell couples preparing for marriage this. So if you pull out a copy of the 1917 Code of Canon Law, you will read the following definition of marriage. Are you prepared to be excited? No. All right. Marriage is for the procreation of offspring and a cure for concupiscence. Okay? So, why get married? Give us children and don't condemn yourself because of your sexual desire. That's what marriage does. Okay? Marriage is a remedy for sexual desire, and it gives us children. How exciting and understanding of marriage is that, right? In the 1930, Pope Pius XI tried to articulate a more robust conception of marriage, okay, in his encyclical Casti Connubii, all right, where he talks about how there's a lot more going on with marriage than just children and containing sin, by presenting a vision of sort of various level of goods in human life that marriage has something to do with, and they all complement and complete one another in a kind of complicated way, okay? The Fathers of the Second Vatican Council present a vision of Christian marriage that builds on all of that earlier work, but again, precisely because of its Christocentric anthropology, is able to present a much more robust understanding of marriage and what marriage is. Thomas Joseph White, I hadn't thought about this, but he's very, very, very smart. Talks, and he's a Thomist, so he talks about how what the Council Fathers do is retrieve the understanding of causality in Thomistic Aristotelianism and apply it to marriage. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, one, St. Thomas Aquinas is a guy who once lived. Okay, Aristotle is a guy who once lived. Aristotle, in his philosophy, presents a vision of causality. Okay, so cause and effect, in which there are 4 ways to talk about causes in the world. Okay. The first is a material cause, all right? So it's good to think about a statue, right? I think that's what you do. Like Philosophy 101, if you're doing Aristotle, you're going to talk about a statue for a while. So if you see a statue, the material cause is the marble, okay? It's the stuff a thing consists of, all right? After the material cause is the formal cause. That's like, what was the vision of the artist that was in mind when the statue was made? So you can imagine, like, Michelangelo has, like, the essence of the Pietà, in a sense, in his mind as he's fashioning it out of marble, okay? And that's a cause. Like, that vision causes the statue in a real way. Good there? Okay? The third is the efficient cause. That's the actual artist making the statue. That's Michelangelo. I have no idea how sculptures are made. I don't know if he's like banging the marble or like sanding the marble, but he's doing something with the marble, okay? That's the efficient cause, all right? And then the fourth way of speaking of causality is the final cause. What something is for, okay? What something is for. The Pietà exists to raise us up, to inspire us, to astound us with beauty, right? So that's what the Pietà is for. Does that make sense to you guys? In modernity, everything gets reduced to efficient causality by science, okay? So the only way to talk about cause is to talk about the thing doing a thing, all right? We don't talk about, only Roman Catholics who really like Thomas Aquinas walk around talking about final causality and formal causality and material. No one else is doing that, right? You're not going to pick up a science textbook and read about formal causality or final causality. Interestingly enough, I once listened to a podcast interviewing some like Darwinian evolutionist, and he admitted that like evolution, when you really want to talk about it honestly, gets you back to an idea of final causality, because with our language we can't help talking about like what certain adaptations in particular species are for, right? So like, what is this development in that creature for, right? So it's like our language is kind of hardwired to talk about final causality, even though our science says that we ought not do so, okay? So anyway, that Thomistic Aristotelian understanding of causality gets read into the Church's theology of marriage in Galimetspez, sections 47 through 52. So here is how this happens. Galimetspez famously dropped the language of multiple ends, multiple like purposes of marriage, okay? And resorted instead to the mature teaching on Aquinas on marriage, in which the conjugal friendship of the two spouses is seen as the formal cause or essence of the marriage, while children and their education are seen as the final cause or the teleological end of the friendship. So now, what's marriage all about? Well, essentially, it's about two persons in a conjugal friendship, like bettering, ennobling one another. That's the essence of marriage. In terms of teleology, like what is all of this oriented toward? Well, yeah, like the procreation of children, the education of offspring. Like married life doesn't stay enclosed upon itself, right? But perpetuates itself forward. And St. John Paul II is going to be able to do a lot with this in his theology of the body when he starts talking about procreation and the sexual act, right? So like love can't keep itself to itself, or there's something missing from love. But importantly, by retrieving this understanding of like formal causality or the essence of marriage as a conjugal friendship, the Church is able to talk to people who aren't capable of having children, let's say, right? For whatever reason. Like it's not as though there's no like profound goodness in your marriage, because the conjugal friendship is there in its essence as a good of marriage. Does that make sense to you guys? Like in 1917, a couple who couldn't procreate, you were like, well, what's the point of getting married? Go join a monastery or something. In 1965, well, there's an awful lot of good that comes, right? Because the mutual sanctification of one another through a conjugal friendship is an awfully wonderful thing to do. And when that mutual sanctification, that kind of relationship is open to new life, you're at like peak human personhood. Okay, so are we good there? Yeah. So this is something that's very. I don't want to say it's new, right? Because we're talking about development of doctrine. All right. So development of church teaching. All of this is in the history of the church, right? Like what is White saying here? In 1965, some folks in Rome open up their copy of the Summa and say, take this, put it here, okay? We've retrieved an important teaching of the church from her past that wasn't present in 1917 or the popular understanding of the church at the time, and saying, here is a better understanding of marriage from our own tradition, okay? Good? All right. So, White talks about marriage, and you know, it's interesting. Again, this is the same basic problem applied again: faith and reason, nature and supernature. What are we or aren't we capable of knowing and doing with and without grace? Okay? Because if you look out at the picture of marriage in the world today, you are probably thinking, can we do anything without grace and faith? Because it seems to be the case that we're getting things awfully wrong in society and culture. That's true and not true. Spouses without faith are getting things right. I mean, you all know, all of us know very secular families who have genuine love for their children. They're doing good work, right? But they're not getting everything right. And importantly, in our culture right now, the voice of the church is absolutely essential to articulating the vision of marriage, because it's demonstrably the case in our law that we've lost an understanding of the goods of marriage. Okay? Does that make sense? We're good there? That same tension, what can we or can't we do on our own without grace? Faith and reason in relation to one another gets applied in all of these different ways. Okay? And remember, all of that comes back to a Christocentric anthropology where there is a lot of good stuff going on with human beings, but without Christ, we will never make sense of ourselves. Okay? So we have to get Christ out there. This is what Galimetspez is saying again and again in so many different ways. Okay? Technology and the dignity of human life. I thought this was fun. This is principle number 4. I thought this was fun because a few years ago I gave this lecture at Loyola on Laudato Si, Pope Francis' encyclical on ecology, the environment, care for our common home, all of that. And in there I focused in particular Pope Francis' focus on technology in the document. And I talked about how the Pope really seems to pick up on an essay that Martin Heidegger published in 1954. So Heidegger is a German existentialist, phenomenologist, probably a Nazi, from the mid-20th century, very important philosopher. And he wrote this essay on technology that is deeply sympathetic, I think, to what the church teaches regarding technology, which is that what technology has done to us is convert the world into raw potential for whatever we want, okay? So there's no more givenness out there. And so Heidegger uses the language of standing reserve, okay? So the whole of reality, the created world, is now just standing reserve. It's a reservation of stuff waiting for us to do whatever we want with, okay? So a river no longer has to be a river, and a mountain no longer has to be a mountain. They can become whatever human beings decide they ought to be, and that is profoundly disordered, okay? In Galimetspez, Thomas Joseph White says that essential critique of Heidegger's becomes sort of built into church teaching on technology, which is to say, technology, because it precisely can make so many things possible, requires a proper understanding of human personhood and the good life in order to keep technology in balance, okay? So in the text of Galimetspez are 3 principles for the responsible use of technology in our lives, okay? So the first is a substantial dignity. There's a substantial dignity to the human being simply by virtue of the fact that he or she exists, independently of one's state of consciousness or degree of mental development, okay? So this is an ontological truth that we need to get right in order to make good use of technology, because otherwise we will just be able to use technology whenever we so desire on whomever we desire or desires to use the technology, okay? But we have to start with the fact that human persons are made in the image and likeness of God, are possessed of that inviolable dignity, and so some technological means are off the table, okay? And we know that. Does that make sense? Good? All right? So, like, no cloning. Nobody clone this weekend. No cloning. Second, Thomistic ethics conveys the notion of responsible freedom, of that freedom of excellence that is teleologically directed towards spiritual love and moral truth. Okay, so freedom needs to be used responsibly. Freedom is about helping us achieve a particular good, God. Okay, technology will either help us with that or hurt us in pursuit of that good. If it helps us, all right. If it hurts us, then we need to get rid of it. But the fact that we can do it doesn't mean that we ought to do it, because freedom is not about doing what we want, it's about doing what we ought, right? Central church teaching. Good there? The third principle, the moral psychology of Aquinas. This guy is all about Aquinas. The moral psychology of Aquinas allows us to see how authentic human beatitude requires the integration of sensible goods and enjoyments into a deeper spiritual and rational pattern of life. What does that mean? We are psychologically complex as human persons. We need all kinds of things for health and balance in life. Technology can make a contribution to that in our lives, but it needs to be interwoven with a pattern of life, that's the language of White, that is authentically spiritual, okay? So whatever technology is going to do for us needs to be integrated into a life that is much larger than one defined and dictated, driven by technological advancement, okay? And, you know, go talk to school students, and, like, that's a real struggle, right? Like, the way in which they engage reality is, like, ever more technological. And I think it gets harder every year to place technology in the right location in their lives as part of something that is much larger, which is to say their spiritual whole, right? Their spiritual lives. So, okay? So the last central principle, the politics of the common good. The common good. The common good is the teaching that the church has, though I don't think most Catholics these days care about it. But all of the things that are necessary for a human person to do well in life, the common good, things that belong to us, things that we need to get on, the common good, that which a society ought to provide and protect so that persons can grow in relationship with God and right relationship with one another, the common good, okay? That's not how we start most political conversations in our world. We tend to start with rights. I have a right to this or a right to that. The church says start by talking about what do you need to be good, and that's what politics ought to be getting for you, okay? The common good. In the teaching of Galimetspez is a clear understanding of the importance of the common good in our moral, ethical, political lives. We don't do well with talking about goods in human life as moral, ethical creatures anymore. We tend to reduce everything to a simple utilitarianism just almost by default. So, like, a thing is good if it helps me get something I want, right? So, like, everything becomes instrumental. Everything is of instrumental value to me. And the goal is some kind of, like, really reductive sense of human happiness, okay? So, basically pleasure-seeking. That's how most of the people out there today understand human happiness. And then the ethical life is about using the stuff in the world to do the best job possible of pleasure-seeking, okay? And we all need to do our pleasure-seeking in a way that allows each of us to pursue our pleasure to the maximal possible extent without impinging upon the pleasure-seeking of others, okay? And that's not a way of understanding human goodness or how we are in relationship to one another as political animals, okay? Good there? So in the Second Vatican Council, in Gaudium et Spes, is a teaching on how the goods of the world need to be understood in a central relationship to who human persons are in the light of Christ, okay? So some goods are just more important, like marriage, okay? So marriage doesn't get instrumentalized for something else. Does that make sense? Marriage is not a means to something else. Marriage is the end. It's a good. So we need to protect that good. Marriage exists as a good in a relation with other goods. There's a hierarchy, okay? So, like, housing is also a good, and so is marriage, and so is stable income. And all of these are important for human persons to flourish, right, in this life. But there's a hierarchy there, all right? Like, protecting marriage as an institution is going to be of greater significance at times than worrying about what housing looks like for certain persons. I mean, it gets really complicated, and we're going to talk about that in 1 second, okay? So, like, settle down. But goods exist in relation to one another and within a hierarchy, okay? So your ability to pursue relationship with the God in freedom is about as important a good as you're going to find. And other good things either contribute to that or might diminish that in whichever way we make use of goods in the world, okay? Does that make sense? But this is not how we talk about political social life in 2022. And we have in quite some time. So first of all, we need to make sure we're getting clear on goods in relation to one another, okay? And so the common good matters, okay? The stuff we need to be good persons matters to everyone, all right? But secondly, and this is fascinating, this is what I just alluded to, Thomas Joseph White puts his finger on something that I hadn't thought too much about, but I've complained about for years, okay? So this is really helpful for me. Catholic social teaching can and must inculcate in modern society a stronger sense of the distinction between fundamental principles of practical reason versus prudential decisions that are conjectural and that require expert opinion as well as complex, fallible estimations. It is one thing to say people need work to live out their human dignity. It is another thing to say this law must be passed because people need work to affirm their human dignity. One is a principle of the moral and ethical life. The other is an attempt to do what is right, which might be more or less good depending on any number of circumstances. Does that make sense to you guys? But we do not honor that distinction in our political discourse most of the time. We tend to go from, here is a principle of the moral life, therefore anything that has something to do with that principle must be done. And that is not necessarily the case, okay? Prudential judgment is distinct from principles of practical reasoning, okay? So moral principles aren't the same as moral judgments. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yes.
Yeah, we do a bad job with this most of the time. But the distinction is really important. And I think the distinction, I was thinking about it because I'm not going to get to it, but in Veritatis Splendor, Pope St. John Paul II's encyclical on Christian morality, basically, it's magnificent. In section 80 of this encyclical, he quotes directly Galimetspez, I think it's 27, on intrinsic evils. And if you read the document, Galimetspez, so this whole list of intrinsic evils, that violations of the dignity of the human person. So the kinds of evils that can never be accepted or tolerated. If we confuse principles with application of principles, the moral life gets a lot harder for us, right? And political life gets a lot harder for us. I was thinking about like how to talk about intrinsic evil versus other evils, and like something like St. Thomas talks about how he asks the question, is it ever lawful to thieve, right? Is it ever lawful to thieve? And his answer is yes, it is at times lawful to thieve, because private property is not actually a right of anyone, says the church. So the stuff of the world exists to get everyone what they need to live the good life. And so for people who have much, they're given the opportunity to provide for those who have little. But if you're a person who has little and need to do the important work of providing for your family, if you steal the bread from the very wealthy baker to feed your child, that's not unlawful. Like, the bread ultimately only belongs to God, and you took God's bread and gave it to your child. But if we confuse principles and application, we can't make those kinds of moral distinctions anymore, because everything becomes black and white. Morality is not black and white. Moral principles are. Okay?
It was worth the class
to hear. Does that make sense to you guys? It's just so important. And it's right there in Galimetspez. So I hope you enjoyed the document, long though it is. I don't have anything else to say. Read Veritatis Splendor, section 80, if you want to see a little bit of what John Paul II does with intrinsic evil. That's super helpful. Other than that, start reading about the liturgy, and I will see you all next week. Okay? Have a good day.